Okay, well, hopefully you came back. So this is the second part of my testimony. Um, so after the cops had gotten me up off the ground and so forth, and I got a hold of my stepdad, he hauled up here, and I remember walking outside and seeing the family that was initially in that room. They were outside and they were all crying, so I knew that they had lost their family as well, or they had lost one of their loved ones. And then I saw my stepdad walk up, and he said, "Where's your mom at?" And I said, "I need you to sit down for a moment because this ain't gonna be easy." And he's like, "Well, what's going on?" I said, "Well, there was a robbery, Dad, and that she was injured, and she didn't make it." For the first time in my life ever, I had to tell somebody that their wife or their mother was dead. And it might have been a lot easier if it had been naturally, or if it had been an accident or something like that, but when somebody makes a decision to rob you of a loved one, that's a pretty hard pill to swallow right there. And I certainly don't wish that upon my worst enemy by any means. So he didn't initially believe me, or the state of shock had just set in. And so he had, got back in his truck, drove up to the place, and come to find out, he was up there, and he went from the police station to the car wash where she worked, down to Parkland Hospital where they eventually took her. And I recall eventually getting back with one of the police officers and telling them that I need to find a way to get down there because he's heading down there and he's not in the best of shape of mind at the point in time. And I remember when I got to Parkland Hospital, my uncle was already down there with him in the emergency room, and they were talking about they needed somebody to identify her body. Well, my stepdad and my uncle at the time were certainly in no shape to do it, and when I had asked the doctor, I said, "What are we going to have to identify, like a part of her body or something like that?" And he said, "Yeah, we'll eventually have to, ask for that." And I said, "If it's a part of her body that's, readable, then I'll go ahead and do it." And he's like, "Yeah, it'll probably be like a hand or a spot on her body." And I said, "Okay," because we never knew where she was shot, when she was killed, or anything like that. We would find out, later on that night. And so I remember walking down that hall, and one of the doctors said, "This is, the part of the body that we're going to identify." And I said, "Okay." And it was just a glimpse of her hand. And I remember it being covered in blood, and one of her rings was on, and that's how I knew. That's how I knew. And there just wasn't much after that. So I walked back down the hall, and I was sitting with my stepdad and uncle at the time, and I remember a lady, like the hospital chaplain or something like that. She says, let's sit down here and pray and so forth like that. I'm like, I really don't want to do this right at the moment. Um, I said, we'll be okay. My stepdad at the time looked at me and said, he's like, how are we going to do this without her? And I said, I don't know, but I know we can. And I was just saying that to try and make him feel better. But at the time, I didn't believe myself because I really didn't. I'm not going to say that by any means I carried a burden or most of the weight during all this. But nobody knew what I was going through that day. To be the actual first one to find out something like this, and then to actually have to deliver the bad news. Like I said, I don't wish that upon anybody in their entire life. So, so we got each other home, and got everybody rested. My stepdad and uncle showed up at the house later on that day at the apartment. He wanted to get a hold of his daughter, or my stepsister, and let her know what had happened, but he couldn't even do it on the phone as well. And I remember having to tell my stepsister what had happened, and it just seemed like that it just got easier. Easier is probably not the best word to use, but every time I had to tell somebody that mom had passed, it was supposed to be harder, and it was supposed to be more unreal, but it just got easier to do. And I didn't totally get it. I thought I was cold and callous, and that I wasn't supposed to feel this way. Some people say, well, maybe that's putting aside your feelings and your emotions and having to deal with, all the things that are happening. Somebody told me, he says, well, you didn't have time to grieve because you had so much to deal with. And I don't know if that's necessarily true, because my grieving happened later on in life. And when I grieved, I literally tore my family apart. And to some extent, I probably still do that today. So, to make a long story short, as far as how that transpired, is that I finally got a hold of everybody that I needed to get hold of. I still couldn't get a hold of my sister, but I had talked to a friend of ours, and they said that she had, that her husband had found her, and that he knew, or he had delivered the news to her, and so forth like that. My sister did more for me in that entire time than more than anybody could ever do. And she was pregnant at the time, so she was 8 months, almost 9 months pregnant at the time. And the burden that she had to bear shouldn't have happened to anybody. But I couldn't have thought of a stronger person to handle that, because to literally take care of a family and a grieving stepdad, that would have been a lot to take care of. So we're going to switch over to the third part of my testimony, and then hopefully you guys will come back.